The rain had already soaked through Eleanor's wool shawl by the time she reached the gate, and still she did not turn back. She had seen the figure from the upper landing window, a man standing at the iron gate with a travelling bag set against his boot, and no carriage in sight. No horse, nothing but the grey October sky pressing down on the whole of the North Country. She had watched him stand there for the better part of a quarter-hour, and in that time not a single servant had been sent out because Lady Vane had seen him too, and pronounced him no one of consequence. Eleanor had gone downstairs anyway. She pulled her shawl tighter and crossed the wet gravel of the drive, and when the man turned at the sound of her footsteps, she saw that he was soaked to the collar, his coat dark with rain and his hat in his hand, as though he had only just removed it out of habit. He was not old. He was perhaps 30, with the kind of face that did not immediately declare itself, features that took a moment to read and then stayed with you. His bearing was composed in a way that had nothing to do with warmth or coldness, simply a quality of stillness that seemed incongruous in a man standing in the rain at a stranger's gate. He said, "I beg your pardon for the intrusion." Eleanor looked at him, and then at the lane behind him, and then at the sky, which showed no sign of relenting. "You have been standing here some time," she said. "I was not certain of my welcome." "You are wet through," she said, which was observation rather than invitation, though it served as both. She unlatched the gate. "The guest cottage is not in use. You may shelter there until the rain passes." He did not thank her effusively, which she noted. He simply inclined his head and took up his bag, and walked with her up the drive in the rain, and that was all. She did not yet know his name. 3 days earlier, Lady Vane had seated Eleanor at the small writing table in the morning room and placed before her a single sheet of correspondence, as though presenting evidence at a hearing. Eleanor recognized the handwriting. She had answered enough of her mother's letters to know every variation of it. "Mr. Whitmore has agreed to the terms," Lady Vane said. She stood at the window with her back to the garden, wearing her second-best silk because Mr. Whitmore was expected to call that afternoon. "He is prepared to honour the full arrangement before Michaelmas, provided the understanding is formalised." Eleanor set down the quill she had been holding. "What understanding? Do not make this tiresome." Lady Vane turned from the window. She was a handsome woman in the manner of women who have understood since girlhood that their face is a kind of currency, and she had spent it carefully, though Eleanor sometimes thought the account had been drawn on rather heavily of late. "Mr. Whitmore is a man of business, and he requires a settled household. You are 25, and your prospects are not improving. This is a sensible arrangement." "You have not asked whether I find it sensible," Eleanor said. "I am telling you that it is," Lady Vane replied. "That serves the same purpose." Eleanor looked at the letter again. The sum mentioned was not stated plainly, but there was a reference to a settlement and a reference to certain prior obligations being discharged, and the language was careful in the way language is careful when the thing being described is not quite respectable if written plainly. She folded the letter and set it back on the table. Her hands, she noted with a kind of clinical distance, were quite steady. "When is he to call?" she asked. 4 o'clock, Lady Vane said, already turning back to the window. Mr. Silas Whitmore arrived at 4:20, which was late enough to be an assertion of his own importance. He was a broad man with a prosperous look, the sort of man whose clothing was always of good quality and always slightly too new, as though he had not yet worn his prosperity long enough to forget it. He shook Eleanor's hand in the hall with the brief efficiency of a man concluding a transaction, and smiled at Lady Vane with considerably more warmth. Eleanor sat through an hour of conversation in the drawing-room, in which Mr. Whitmore discussed the expansion of his mill at Harwick, the price of worsted wool, and his opinions on the management of household accounts with the particular confidence of a man who had never encountered a room that required him to listen. Eleanor poured the tea. She passed the biscuits. She answered his two direct questions, which concerned her ability to manage a household of 7 and whether she played the pianoforte, with the shortest sufficient answers she could produce without discourtesy. He did not ask her a third question. When he had gone, Lady Vane stood in the drawing-room doorway with an expression of satisfied determination. "He is perfectly acceptable," she said. Eleanor thought of the way he had looked at the tea service and found it wanting, and said nothing. The guest cottage stood at the eastern boundary of the Vane estate, close enough to the kitchen garden to smell the herbs in summer, and far enough from the main house to provide a gentleman with privacy. It was furnished plainly, but not meanly, with a writing table near the window, a grate that had not been lit in 6 weeks, and 2 shelves of books that Eleanor had placed there herself the previous year against the possibility of a guest who could read. She went that evening with Mrs. Holt, the housekeeper, carrying dry firewood in a basket, because the arrangement with the cottage had been made so quickly that no one had thought to lay a fire. Mrs. Holt was a compact woman of 50-something, with hair the colour of iron and a manner that combined complete efficiency with a sharp, observational warmth. She had been at the Vane estate since before Eleanor was born, and Eleanor trusted her the way you trust the ground under your feet, without thinking about it much, but being very aware of it when it shifts. The man opened the cottage door before Eleanor could knock, as if he had heard her on the path. He had changed into dry clothes which were plain but of a quality that she registered without quite noting it, and he had set his wet coat over the chair back nearest the cold grate with the automatic tidiness of a man accustomed to ordering his own space. "I brought wood," Eleanor said, "and some bread and cold meat from the kitchen. I'm afraid it is not much." "It is more than enough," he said. He stepped back from the door. "Will you come in from the cold, miss?" "Vane," she said. "Eleanor Vane." He stood still for a moment that lasted perhaps a beat longer than expected. "William Dixon," he said. "I am grateful to you, Miss Vane." Mrs. Holt set the basket down near the grate and began laying the fire with the efficiency of someone who knows exactly how much time a thing requires and intends to take no more. Eleanor set the bread and cloth-wrapped meat on the writing table. The cottage felt smaller with the 3 of them in it, not uncomfortably so, simply present in a way that empty rooms are not. She noticed his hands while he was helping Mrs. Holt with the firewood, passing logs from the basket in a practiced way. They were not the hands of a man who had spent his life in manual labour, nor were they the soft hands of a man who had spent it exclusively indoors. They were simply careful hands, precise and unhurried, and they struck her as belonging to a man of a somewhat different life than the one he appeared to be leading. She did not pursue the thought. It was not her concern. Outside, the rain was still coming down, and the lane beyond the estate gate was likely a river of mud. Over the following days, the rain did not pass so much as reduce itself to a persistent grey weight that kept the roads questionable and the sky the colour of pewter. William remained in the cottage. Eleanor brought provisions each morning with the kitchen girl, and occasionally she came alone. She did not examine her reasons for coming alone. The cottage was on her way to the kitchen garden, where she checked the stores for winter. That was sufficient explanation. On the 3rd morning she found him reading at the window with a cup of tea grown cold beside him, and he looked up with the expression of a man caught in the middle of a thought rather than the middle of a sentence. The book was one from the cottage shelves, a volume of Cowper that she had placed there herself. "You read Cowper," she said, which was not a question. "He understood constraint," William said. "There is something in that which is useful on a rainy morning." Eleanor sat down in the chair across the writing table without quite deciding to. "You have been travelling," she said. "Where were you coming from when the rain brought you here?" He set the book down, face open on the table. "From a place I was not sorry to leave," he said, "toward a place I was not yet ready to arrive at." She looked at him. He was watching the rain on the window glass, and not her face, which made it possible to look at him for a moment with more directness than was quite usual. He had the quality, she thought, of a man who had been given a great deal that he had not asked for and was working out what to do with it. She had met few enough men like that to find it notable. "That is a particular kind of travelling," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "It is." Mrs. Holt appeared in the cottage doorway with a fresh kettle and took in the room with one sweep of her sharp eyes. She set the kettle on the great hook, removed the cold cup from beside William, and replaced it with a clean one, and said to Eleanor with absolute neutrality, "Your mother has asked for you in the morning room, Miss Vane." Eleanor rose. She picked up her basket. At the cottage door she paused and looked back, and William had already returned to Cowper, though she thought the page he was reading was the same one she had seen when she arrived. Lady Vane was waiting in the morning room with a letter and an expression of decided satisfaction. "Mr. Whitmore will come to dinner on Thursday," she said. "He is bringing his man of business to discuss the settlement." Eleanor took the chair by the fire without being invited to. "What settlement, precisely?" Lady Vane set the letter down with a little more force than necessary. "The settlement that will discharge the obligations on this house," she said. "Which have been accumulating, Eleanor, in case you have not observed it, since your father's illness." Eleanor had observed it. She had been observing it for 3 years, in the form of reduced staff and the closing of the east wing, and the morning room fire that was now laid later each day as coal grew more considered. She had not raised it because there was nothing useful she could do with the information. "How much?" she asked. Lady Vane's expression shifted toward displeasure. "That is not your concern." "If I am the instrument by which it is discharged," Eleanor said, "then it is very precisely my concern." Her mother said nothing for a moment. Then, with the tone of a woman concluding a matter rather than opening one, "Mr. Whitmore's settlement will resolve the debt. That is what matters." Eleanor looked at the fire. The coal was good quality today, which meant Lady Vane expected the day to require stamina. Thursday brought Mr. Whitmore in a hired carriage with a small, pale man called Crewe, who carried a leather document case and spoke in the quiet register of someone whose words were meant for the room's transaction rather than its people. Lady Vane had the dining table laid with the best linen and the silver plate that had not been brought out since Eleanor's father died. Eleanor dressed for dinner in her grey silk, which was her most presentable and her least loved, and went downstairs to find Mr. Whitmore already in the hall examining the portrait of Eleanor's late father with the evaluating expression of a man pricing an asset. Dinner was a precisely managed performance. Lady Vane steered the conversation through topics that showed the house to advantage, and Mr. Whitmore ate with appetite and spoke with authority, and Mr. Crewe ate very little and said nothing at all. Eleanor answered questions when addressed, which was not frequently. After dinner, while Lady Vane and Mr. Whitmore sat in the drawing-room and Mr. Crewe opened his document case, Eleanor excused herself to the passage outside on the grounds of needing a shawl from the upper landing. She was entirely honest about the shawl. It was cold in the passage, and she did want it. She had not planned to pause on the landing where the passage ran close to the drawing-room wall, where the old plaster had thinned enough over the years that voices from inside carried clearly into the corridor. She had not planned to hear what she heard. Her mother's voice, lowered but not lowered enough, carried its own particular precision even through plaster and oak panel. The debt stands at £450, and I will not have it spoken of plainly, Whitmore. There is no need for plain speaking between people of sense. Mr. Whitmore's voice was comfortable and unhurried. The settlement I am proposing is £800, Lady Vane. That discharges your debt and leaves a surplus, which I will consider the proper accounting of a connected family. A pause in which Eleanor heard the sound of the fire and nothing else. Her mother again. She is manageable, she is not romantic about it, which is a mercy. I think you will find she requires very little direction. She has always understood her position in this house. Eleanor stood in the passage with her hand flat against the plaster wall, and the cold seeping up through the stone floor into her feet through her thin evening slippers. She was very still. The kind of stillness that is not calm, but is what comes immediately before a decision. She is manageable. £800, 450 against a debt her father had left and her mother had grown, set against Eleanor's compliance, her willingness to take a man who had shaken her hand like a ledger entry and asked her 2 questions in an hour of conversation. She stood there until she was certain she was not going to do something visible. Then she went upstairs and retrieved the shawl and came back down. When she entered the drawing room, she smiled at no one in particular and took her seat and poured tea when it was required and said nothing at all. But she knew now precisely what she was worth to her mother in pounds and practical terms, and the knowledge sat in her chest like a stone in cold water. The next morning she went to the cottage. She had not planned to tell him anything, and she did not. She brought the bread and 2 apples from the store and a small pot of the kitchen's last blackberry preserve. And she knocked, and William opened the door, and he looked at her face for exactly 1 moment before he stepped back without a word and let her in. He did not ask what was wrong. He put a fresh log on the fire and poured tea from the pot already on the grate and handed her the cup and sat down in his chair by the window with Cowper face down on the sill and said nothing. Eleanor sat with the warm cup in both hands and looked at the fire for a while. "I am to be married," she said at last, "to a man whose name I had not heard 6 days ago." William said nothing immediately. Outside, a thin November rain had replaced the heavier rain of the previous week, and the kitchen garden beyond the cottage window was bare and precise in the grey light. "Do you wish to be?" he asked. "No," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Then do not be," he said. She looked at him then, and he was watching her with that particular quality of attention that she had noticed in him from the first morning in the cottage, the kind of attention that did not demand anything of the person receiving it. "It is not so simple as that," she said. "I know," he said. "I am not saying it is simple. I am saying do not do it." She turned the cup in her hands. The fire crackled and settled. Outside, a robin landed on the kitchen garden wall and departed again immediately. "If I refuse," she said, "my mother will have no instrument for the debt, and the house will begin to go in the spring." "Yes," William said. "You are not arguing me out of that," she observed. "No," he said. "I am not." She sat with that. It was a strange thing to be told a hard truth and not to be managed away from it. She had not expected it. She was not certain what she had expected. They sat in the cottage with the fire between them and the November rain outside, and Eleanor thought about what it meant to know the exact price your mother had put on you, and William sat across from her in complete stillness, and neither of them said anything further for some time. When she rose to go, he stood as well. He had set her coat, the wool one she had loaned him the night she brought him in from the gate, on the chair near the door, freshly brushed, and he handed it to her with the same unhurried quietness with which he did everything. "Thank you," she said. He inclined his head. She walked back up to the main house with the coat over her arm and the small pot of blackberry preserve still on the cottage table because she had forgotten to leave it, and he had not pointed this out. It was a small thing. She noted it the way you note something that is simply true. Over the next several days there was a quality in the Vane household that felt like the hour before a weather change. Mr. Whitmore was due to return on the following Tuesday to formalise the arrangement. Lady Vane had informed Eleanor at breakfast on the Saturday, and Eleanor was to make herself available and agreeable. Eleanor had said yes, certainly, in the tone she reserved for information she was not yet ready to dispute. She was in the estate library on the Sunday morning when William came to the door, which surprised her, because he had not been inside the main house since the night she had brought him to the cottage. She looked up from the account ledger she was not precisely reading, and he was standing in the library doorway in a coat that fit him rather better than his travelling coat, and she wondered briefly where he had gotten it, before she recalled that Mrs. Holt, with the particular pragmatism of a woman who managed what was available, had found something in the clothes press from her father's time. "The cottage shelves are exhausted," he said. "I had wondered if your library might extend to something I have not read." Eleanor indicated the shelves. "Most of it is my father's. He had Catholic taste, and no organisational principle." William moved along the shelves with his hands behind his back, reading spines in the way of a person who has done a great deal of it and is genuinely engaged by the problem. Eleanor returned to the ledger, or appeared to. In fact, she was aware of him the way you are aware of a fire in a cold room, as a fact about the space rather than something requiring your attention. He pulled down a volume of Burns and stood reading the opened page for long enough that she looked up again. "You read Scottish poetry in a Yorkshire library on a November morning," she said. "It seemed apt," he said. He crossed to the second chair by the writing table and sat down with the volume, entirely at ease. And for the next hour they sat in the library with the fire between them and the grey window light falling across the writing table. And Eleanor turned the pages of the ledger without retaining much, and William read Burns without appearing to find it strange that they were sitting in companionable quiet in a room that was not his. At one point she reached for the pen on the table, and their hands were very close, not touching, simply adjacent in the narrow space between the ink pot and the ledger edge, and she was aware of it with an acuity that was not comfortable and not entirely unpleasant. And she moved the pen and drew the ledger closer and returned to the columns of figures. He noticed. She was nearly certain he noticed. He said nothing and turned his page, and the fire shifted in the grate with a small sound. When she finally closed the ledger and set it aside, he looked up. "Whatever you decide on Tuesday," he said, "you will be right." She looked at him for a moment. "You do not know what I will decide." "No," he said, "but I know the quality of the person deciding it." Eleanor picked up the ledger and the pen and stood. She looked at him in the armchair with the Burns open on his knee and her father's library around him, as if he had always been there, and she thought about that, and did not say anything more. On Tuesday, Mr. Whitmore arrived at noon. He came without Mr. Crewe this time, which meant the document case was not present, which meant Lady Vane intended this to be a domestic and social occasion, rather than a formal one. The drawing-room had been arranged, Eleanor noticed, with the chairs positioned so that there was a natural pair of seats near the window, toward which Lady Vane was clearly intending to steer Eleanor and Mr. Whitmore at the earliest opportunity. Eleanor sat near the fireplace instead. Lady Vane asked her twice, in tones of mounting pleasantness, to come and see the autumn light on the garden from the window, which was transparently not what she was being asked. Eleanor thanked her and said the fire was comfortable. Mr. Whitmore watched this exchange with the expression of a man recalculating. He had brought a small parcel of ribbons from the town, which he presented to Eleanor with something approaching warmth, the nearest he had come to it in her acquaintance. Eleanor thanked him and set it on the side table. Lady Vane said, with the clarity of someone removing a veil from a prepared picture, "Mr. Whitmore has something he wishes to ask you, Eleanor." Eleanor set down her teacup. Mr. Whitmore produced a small, correct bow from his chair, which was the posture of a man performing a formality he considers concluded. "Miss Vane, I should be very pleased if you would consent to be my wife." The drawing room was quiet. The fire ticked. Lady Vane was watching Eleanor with an expression that mixed expectation and warning in equal measure. Eleanor thought of the passage outside the drawing room and the thinned plaster, and her mother's voice saying she is manageable. She thought of £800 set against 450, and the arithmetic of what she represented in that transaction. She thought of William in the cottage saying, "Do not do it," with the particular quality of a man who means exactly what he says without requiring you to act on it. She looked at Mr. Whitmore. "I am sensible of the honour," she said, "and I cannot accept." The silence that followed was of a different character than the silence before it. Mr. Whitmore's expression shifted through several registers: surprise, reassessment, and then something colder. Lady Vane made a sound that was not a word and then stood up. "Eleanor," her mother's voice was very controlled, "you will wish to reconsider." "No," Eleanor said with the same level tone she used for everything. "I do not think I will." Lady Vane looked at her with an expression that Eleanor had seen before in other configurations, the expression of a woman discovering that an instrument she had been relying upon has its own intentions. "Do you understand what you are doing? Do you understand what this house requires?" "I understand precisely what this house requires," Eleanor said. "I heard it spoken plainly on Thursday evening in this room, through a wall that carries sound rather better than you are perhaps aware." Lady Vane's colour changed. It was not a dramatic change, but it was complete and immediate, the flush of someone who has been seen in a posture they considered private. Mr. Whitmore rose from his chair. He was not a man who had been refused before, and he did not receive it with grace. He said, with the chill of someone closing a ledger, "I see that the situation is not as represented, Lady Vane," and picked up his hat and nodded to the room in general and left. The sound of the drawing-room door was followed by the sound of his boots in the hall, and then the outer door, and then, after a moment, the carriage on the gravel. Lady Vane stood in the drawing-room with her hands at her sides and her face in an expression that Eleanor could not entirely read. It was not fury, or not only that. It had the quality of a woman looking at something she had managed into a shape she required, and finding the shape has not held. "You have ruined us," Lady Vane said. "I have refused a man I was not consulted about marrying," Eleanor said. "Those are different things." Lady Vane sat down. Eleanor thought she looked, for the first time in some years, as though she were genuinely considering something rather than managing toward a conclusion. It was into this stillness that Mrs. Holt appeared at the drawing-room door. She had an expression that Eleanor recognized as her housekeeper's version of controlled urgency, the face of a woman carrying information that cannot be held back without consequences. "Forgive me, ma'am," Mrs. Holt said, addressing Lady Vane but looking at Eleanor. "There is a letter arrived for Mr. Dixon at the cottage. I have brought it as he was here in the house when it came." She held out the letter, which was sealed in a particular way, the wax pressed with a device that was visible even across the room. "And my lord is in the front hall." Lady Vane looked up. "My lord?" Mrs. Holt's expression did not shift. "I beg your pardon," she said with the precision of someone who is not, in fact, apologizing. "Mr. Dixon." But it was too late. Eleanor looked at Mrs. Holt, and then at the letter in her hand, and then at the door. And something in the room had altered in the way that rooms alter when a significant truth enters them, before anyone has spoken it aloud. William was standing in the hall doorway. He had heard Mrs. Holt, that was apparent. He was looking at the housekeeper with the expression of a man who has prepared himself for a particular moment and has arrived at it slightly ahead of schedule. He looked then at Eleanor. Mrs. Holt, with the composure of a woman who has been in service long enough to understand that some facts must be named plainly, said, "The letter bears the seal of the Ashford estate, my lady. It is directed to the Earl of Ashford." She paused. "Mr. Dixon has been a guest in your cottage for 11 days. Lady Vane was very still. Eleanor looked at William, who had crossed the hall threshold into the drawing-room doorway, and she looked at his face, and she thought of a great many things in a very short time. The precision of his hands on the cottage firewood, the quality of stillness he carried that had never quite matched the surface of a travelling stranger, the way he had read Cowper at the window and Burns in her father's library as a man in his own place rather than a borrowed one, the coat that fit him in the library on Sunday, which had fitted him differently from the one he had arrived in. "Do not do it," spoken by a man who had known what he was saying. She thought of the coat she had given him at the gate. He was watching her. Not her mother, not the letter in Mrs. Holt's hand, not the room. Her. He said quietly, "I had intended to explain it better than this." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "Did you know," she asked, "about Mr. Whitmore, about the arrangement?" "Not until the evening of the dinner," he said. "Mrs. Holt told me what she understood of it." Mrs. Holt neither confirmed nor denied this, her face arranged in the expression of a woman who has done exactly what she believed was right and will accept all consequences with equanimity. "And this morning," Eleanor said, "you knew I intended to refuse him." "I had hoped you would," he said. "I did not know." Lady Vane said in a voice that had lost its performance quality and was now simply her own voice, somewhat diminished, "You are the Earl of Ashford." "Yes," William said without looking away from Eleanor. Lady Vane seemed to be calculating something rapidly, the way a person recalculates when the foundational figures in an equation are replaced. The Ashford estate lay 40 miles to the north. The earldom was one of the older ones in the county. A man who had stood at her gate in the rain and been given shelter in her guest cottage, and been brought bread and cold meat by her daughter, and been read to, in a manner of speaking, in her late husband's library. "You travelled without your carriage," Lady Vane said, as though this were the relevant fact. "I preferred it," William said. Eleanor, who had been standing beside the fireplace this entire time without being quite aware of it, set her teacup down on the mantelpiece with a small, precise sound. "You might have said," she told him, and her voice was level, which did not mean she was not feeling anything. "I might have," he agreed, "and if I had, you would have known it when you offered me shelter, and when you brought the firewood, and when you sat in the cottage and told me what you intended to do on Tuesday." She considered this. Outside, the sound of Mr. Whitmore's carriage had long since disappeared down the lane, and the November afternoon was very quiet. "You wanted to know what I was," she said. "I wanted to know who you were," he said. "I had already seen what you are. I saw it at the gate." Lady Vane made a sound that was not quite speech. It had the quality of a woman who has spent considerable energy arranging a social outcome and has found that the room she was arranging contained someone she had not accounted for. Mrs. Holt moved quietly to the sideboard and occupied herself with the arrangement of cups. William reached into the inside of his coat and produced the letter, which Mrs. Holt had passed to him in the hall. He did not open it. He set it on the writing table by the window, and then he crossed the room toward Eleanor, and he held out the coat, the wool coat she had loaned him at the gate 11 days ago, freshly brushed as it had been every morning since she loaned it, and folded with the care of someone who has handled a thing and valued it. "I believe this is yours," he said. Eleanor took the coat. She looked at it, and at the care with which it had been kept, and at the man holding it out to her, and she was aware of the fire at her back, and Mrs. Holt at the sideboard, and her mother silent in her chair, and she thought that this was a very peculiar drawing-room scene, and also, beneath that thought, something much simpler. "You should have told me," she said. "Yes," he said, "I should have. I was not ready to stop." "Stop what?" "Being nobody in particular," he said, to someone who treated nobody in particular as a person of consequence. Lady Vane, who had been taking in this exchange from her chair by the window with the expression of a woman recalibrating the fundamental assumptions of the previous fortnight, drew a breath. "Lord Ashford," she said, with the careful enunciation of someone addressing a social fact she is still arriving at, "I hope you will understand that the circumstances of your arrival were unusual, and that the household has done its best to." "Miss Vane's household," William said with the mild precision of a man choosing one word over several others, "has been nothing but kind." He looked at Lady Vane directly, without hostility and without warmth, the look of a man who has seen a thing plainly and is not going to pretend otherwise. "More kind than it was perhaps required to be." Lady Vane closed her mouth. She looked at her daughter. Eleanor was standing at the fireplace with the folded coat in her hands, and her expression entirely her own, unperformed, undirected, simply present in the way Eleanor was always simply present, when she believed no one important was watching. Lady Vane had been in the same room as that face every day for 25 years, and she was only now seeing it clearly. "I would speak with Miss Vane," William said, "if she is willing." Lady Vane stood. She looked at Eleanor and then at the door, and she left the drawing-room with her back very straight, and Mrs. Holt followed her with the quiet efficiency of a woman who knows when a room requires clearing and does it without making it a statement. The drawing-room was warm and still. The fire had settled into a steady, low burn. The November light came in at the west window at the long afternoon angle, pale and particular, the kind of light that makes everything it falls on look precisely itself. Eleanor set the folded coat on the mantelpiece. She turned and looked at William, who was standing in the middle of the room with his hands at his sides and the letter unopened on the writing table behind him. "I am not certain," she said, "how to address you now." "William would do," he said, "if you are willing." She considered him, the same way she had considered him in the cottage doorway on the first morning, measuring something that was not size or appearance but was harder to name. "You came from the north," she said, "towards somewhere you were not ready to arrive at." "Yes," he said. "And now?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, a late-season thrush called once from the kitchen garden wall, and did not repeat it. "I think," he said, "I may have arrived." Eleanor looked at the coat on the mantelpiece, the plain wool she had pulled from the peg in the hall, without thinking 11 days ago, and then at the man who had folded it with the same care every morning without being asked, and she thought that there were some things that did not require a great deal more words than they had already used. "Then you had better come out of the doorway," she said. He crossed the room. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough that she had to look up slightly, and he was watching her with the same quality of attention she had first noticed at the cottage, the kind that required nothing in return. "The library is warmer in the morning," she said, "if you intend to stay." "I intend to stay," he said. The late afternoon light moved across the writing table between them, and the fire settled again in the grate, and Eleanor stood in her father's drawing-room in her grey silk with the folded coat on the mantelpiece behind her, and she thought that she had refused a man who had treated her as a sum to be settled, and been seen by a man who had stood at a gate in the rain and understood something about her from the way she crossed gravel, and that the distance between those two things was the distance between one kind of life and another. She did not say any of this. There was no need. The following morning, Eleanor was at the library window when William came through the door, with a cup of tea in each hand, navigating the threshold with the care of a man who has learned which floorboard tips. And she thought that 11 days was enough time to learn a floor if you had been paying attention from the beginning. She took the cup he offered. She looked out at the kitchen garden, bare in the November light, and at the cottage beyond it, with its low smoke rising into the grey sky, and at the lane beyond the estate gate where the mud had frozen overnight into ridged, pale furrows. He stood beside her at the window. The library was warm and quiet, and full of her father's books in their unsorted abundance, and the coat was on the chair by the fire where she had put it herself that morning, and outside the garden waited for spring with the patience of things that know what they are. She did not need to say where she was. She was already there.